Thank you, everyone, for sharing your responses. Very interesting to see. And I think that especially your responses to the last question shows the breadth and scope and depth of intersectionality and what it can offer us, the potential. And that's what I want to touch on in my presentation today. Before I start, I want to say that my understanding of intersectionality and my practice around intersectionality is related to years of work in which I've slowly become more aware and deepen my awareness and understanding of intersectionality. So the question the first question around how much do you understand and how much do you need to learn? I'm continually learning new ways of applying intersectionality. So it's an ongoing learning process, is something that I want to mention. So having done work with the women's and gender justice movement in Turkey, for example, as a funder and as a participant in that movement, but also at the LSE International Inequalities Institute. And more recently, I worked with a European foundation called the Robert Bosch Foundation to develop a program around providing support for organizations that are advancing intersectional practice, trying to embed intersectionality and decolonial approaches within their work. That's a global program. I'll be referring to that in the presentation. And of course, through the Equality Impact Investing Project, which is the hat that I'm wearing here today. And we'll be focusing more on intersectionality within social and impact investing, but also it applies to philanthropy and all of the different areas that you've highlighted in terms of hiring practices, EDI, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And a special thank you to Diversity Forum, Salma and Sally for convening us today, and to Izzy for being part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So a great way to start thinking about intersectionality is to listen to the words of Audre Lorde, the scholar and activist who helped shape a lot of our thinking around intersectionality and racial justice, particularly intersectional feminism. You're probably familiar with her phrase, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives." And that's really something fundamentally underpinning to the idea of intersectionality. So let's step back and look at intersectionality from the perspective of sort of how we can break it down into its kind of fundamental components. So here on the left, you see kind of all of these different social categories, identity categories laid out from race, ethnicity, gender identity, class. And what intersectionality enables us to do is it's a framework that enables us to see how individuals and groups are affected by multiple forms of discrimination that relate to how all these different categories affect the discrimination, affect their experiences with discrimination and exclusion. It considers how those factors combine, they overlap and intersect as a whole, creating an entirely new experience. So it's not that race and gender, you add on the experiences of a racialized around race or around gender, but really when you bring the two together, that creates a completely unique experience in itself. And it's also important to acknowledge that those experiences will vary over time, context, and place. Yeah, so they're not fixed categories either. So as you start engaging with the idea of intersectionality with this tool, you're really trying to understand not only these categories in isolation from each other, but how they interact and how they're contextualized. So again, identity isn't relational, it's not predetermined. And this intersectionality is absolutely essential if we want to understand how to transform and how to understand and transform the causes and impacts of inequality, yeah, and how to challenge them. So you need the analysis, but then of inequality through an intersectional lens, but then you also need to apply it in practice. And I'll come to that as we go through this. So there's there's different layers. So the first layer of intersectionality is understanding the the combination of identities, positions, and categories. But then intersectionality takes us even further. And so the term intersectionality was coined by the scholar and activist Kimberly Crenshaw. I've put a quote here where she reminds us that intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. So this aspect of power, having a power analysis, is a very important second dimension of intersectionality. So that multi-level analysis brings us to looking at how those individual experiences link up to broader structures and symptoms, all the way from the micro, so the household level, to the structural level, at the level of, for example, how economic systems or markets operate, or political systems. So you can carry out an intersectional power analysis across all these systems and layers. And you will also, what we ought to be doing is also having a critical analysis of categories and positions, because as I said before, they're not fixed, which means that power is relational. Someone can experience both privilege and oppression at the same time, depending on context, depending on who else they're engaging with. And the other aspect of power is not only seeing how it's being produced and reproduced, but also how it's being resisted. Yeah, and I think that's where, as funders or investors, we come in, is to really think about how to use an intersectional lens, not only to identify the impacts of exclusion and discrimination on people and how to remedy that, but also how to ensure that people are able to resist and challenge systems of oppression that are causing those inequalities. Okay, so hello? Should I keep going? Okay, so let's look at now intersectionality, inequality, and social impact investing. Here are some challenges with embedding intersectionality and inequality with social impact investing. I'm sure you can add to this, or you might want to clarify or articulate these in a different way. Some on the diversity forum have been doing quite a lot of thinking around this as well. First, the sector is shaped by prevailing norms and logics within our social, cultural, economic, and political systems. There are some shifts taking place, but for the most part, hearkening back to those norms, continuing to use them only maintains the status quo. Yeah. There's also a lack of diversity within the sector, which is why there's an initiative like Diversity Forum and many others, particularly at leadership positions, that contributes to power differentials and favors particular approaches to change. So it creates this relationship between the giver and the receiver that's fundamentally disempowering. Implicit bias, the importance of social capital. So the more social capital and privilege you have, the more access to capital and networks you have. And then the emphasis on service delivery over transformative approaches to change. And again, that's something that just maintains the status quo. Grant making and investment policies, practices reproduce inequalities such as short-term funding, onerous application processes. And then I think that there's also another piece of this, which is to what extent are we really applying and know how to apply a critical analysis to structural inequalities? And overall, I think there's a tendency to favor simplicity over complexity. That's very human, but I think if we're tackling something as deeply rooted and entrenched and intersectional as inequalities, we need to be ready to embrace complexity. And the result is that funding reaches a select few groups and issue areas. Here's a drawing that emerged from a dialogue that we had with some groups working in the climate justice movement, for example, even though this focuses on education. So you can see the simplicity versus the complexity here. Yeah, and so you may be looking to tackle education, you may be looking to tackle health or elderly, but there are all these different factors to bring in, and that's what an intersectional lens can enable you to do. And why is this important? Again, I talked earlier about the imbalance in funding in terms of outcomes, who receives the funding and who doesn't. And there's a lot of different statistics here in, for example, funding directed towards gender equality. Only 1% of that reaches women's rights organizations. The rest of it stays with large development agencies, governments, and INGOs. In the UK, grants to the women and girls sector received only 1.8%, about 2% of overall grant funding. And a third of that went to organizations with no specific focus on women and girls. And if you dig even further into the data, it's also apparent that there's sort of problems in terms of the intersectionality of the funding that's offered to the women and girls sector. Extend Ventures has seminal research around the number of percentage of female founders, Black founders, and Black female entrepreneurs who receive VC funding. Same thing with in the LGBTQ space as well, where 75% of startup funders and 79% of investors conceal their sexual orientation or identity. And then there's also been research done by London funders in terms of their COVID response funding, where intersectional organizations, their work to support their communities is simply just more challenging. And therefore, we really need to think about how to provide suitable funding for those kinds of issues. I'm going to go straight to this, which is why actually equality impact investing, the EIIP project was formed to help strengthen the field of equality impact investing, which is a form of investing that seeks to primarily tackle and reduce the symptoms and causes of inequality. And the way we do that is we support investors, we offer training. Most of our work is focused in the UK on the social investment sector. And I'm just going to lay out here kind of how are we applying kind of some of these intersectionality principles to practice. First, we encourage investors to develop an impact thesis that sets out clear equality impact goals based on a critical intersectional analysis of the inequality they want to address. This tool here is actually a framework that was developed by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And we found that it's very useful for investors to think on the left in terms of, you see the characteristics. So who are you trying to address? Being really clear about that and using an intersectional lens to really understand what are the experiences of discrimination. And then the domains relate to, well, where is that inequality being expressed and how? And then the three levels, outcomes, how is the inequality showing up in people's lives in terms of education levels, health levels, income levels, for example, but then digging even deeper, again, looking at that, doing that multi-layer analysis from the micro to the macro. So what are the institutional processes, other mechanisms, laws, and cultural norms, processes, and structures which are causing the inequality, and can you as an impact investor through the investees and ventures that you work with, can you work towards addressing those deeper root causes? And then, of course, you can apply a power analysis right across the investment process, all the way from how you develop your investment thesis, which we just talked about, how you source investments, how you carry out screening and due diligence, deal making, deal terms, monitoring and evaluation, and exit. All these areas are ripe for reimagining from the standpoint of intersectionality. And then we also encourage investors to use the EII in strategies. So they're laid out here. We encourage investors to improve their own makeup and practice. And so that's where DEI really comes in. And to support ventures with good DEI practice, provide capital to marginalized entrepreneurs. As I've already laid out, there's an enormous gap there. And then target organizations whose core mission is to tackle inequality. And then fourth, this here is a group of people sitting around a decision-making table. saying, let's not invite affected populations to the table just yet. I want to make sure we understand intersectionality really well first. Take the plunge. In our experience, when we designed the grant-making program with the Robert Bosch Foundation, there was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning, and we set it up as we looked at it as a process of learning. And as I said at the very beginning, and hopefully made clear throughout this presentation, it's you want to embrace and lean into the complexity, because that is where you can be more effective in designing your the approaches that you're going to undertake and support, but also your own practices in terms of how you're working with communities, how you're working with organizations, and how you're working as an organization internally, board, senior management, staff, partnerships. And it does take time. It takes a lot of in-depth reflection as well. But set the intention and begin the journey, rather than wait to have a complete analysis developed. You will learn so much by just taking the first step. And I'd also say that openness to learning is very important, but also taking a relational approach. So really building trust and listening is also key to going forward with an intersectional approach. So there's lots of resources out there. Here's some of them. Of course, the Diversity Forum and its manifesto, our own training and digital toolkit and resource hub, the Equality Fund, which is a major Canada-funded, government-funded initiative, just developed intersectional investment guidelines. And then at the Robert Bosch-Stiftung, we've developed a number of publications, learning pieces around the transformative power of intersectionality, which I'd encourage you to look at. And of course, there's the DEI data standard, which will enable you to also conduct that analysis and really understand sort of where kind of people are at the intersections of power and inequality. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Izzy to really bring us to the sort of real practical level of what this means in the social impact investing sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. I am going to share my screen. Oh, hopefully you can all see my screen. Can you see my screen? I have that perpetual fear that I'm going to share my screen and you'll see the 100 tabs of what I'm ordering off Amazon or something. But as long as you can all see the presentation, that's the most important thing. So by way of introduction, so I am Izzy Obeng, as I've said, and I run Foundervine. We focus on supporting entrepreneurs, primarily entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds who are starting and growing businesses. And the last 5 years, we've seen ourselves as activists within industry in a way. Yes, we are supporting founders to build and scale businesses and raise investment. Yes, we are working with industry in different ways that I will explain shortly. But first and foremost for us, we are a voice for founders who often don't get a seat at the table. We see our role influencing kind of government and industry is just as important as supporting founders on an individual level, because without that kind of ecosystem change in terms of one, who's at the table and kind of what they're saying in terms of the specific support that's needed to support businesses from all backgrounds, the kind of investment that's needed, alternative investment types that meet the needs of these businesses more effectively. It's so important, we feel, that we're at the conversation when it comes to senior levels of industry and also government as well. So what we do is essentially build accelerators in partnership with government and industry, and run a series of initiatives and activities that are all designed with 3 aims. The first, to increase access to entrepreneurship and innovation to those who have previously felt unable to access those spaces. Two, to accelerate growing businesses who have done all the amazing work to get to a certain point and who need support in terms of access to networks, access to information, access to knowledge and training, and get them the support that they need to scale their businesses. And thirdly, as I've mentioned, to be an advocate for these businesses within the wider ecosystem as well. So ultimately, we are trying to see a world where there are no social or economic barriers to innovation, and everyone, regardless of where you're from or what your background is, have similar opportunities to start, grow, fail, pick up again businesses of various kinds. We have what I like to call a bit of a Robin Hood model to what we do, in that we recognise that industry has a special role in terms of supporting early businesses, and industry has a special role in terms of solving some of the challenges we have around diversity, inclusion and equity in society. I think every single business needs to have that kind of double bottom line between kind of answering to shareholders and also making sure that they are returning to communities in different ways. So from the very beginning of our journey, I should say we are a social enterprise ourselves, and have quite varied experience with social investors, in that we raised 3 rounds of social investment ourselves, but we are also an organisation that supports other social impact organisations to access social investment as well. So we have relationships in different ways with social investors. But our primary model is kind of working with mostly kind of corporate partners, higher education, institutions to build accelerators, to build programs that are often completely free to the entrepreneurs that come on our programs. It's been a really interesting journey for us. And in the beginning, we found that, so when we started in 2018, we found that it was very different having the conversations that we have now. You know, we're not even talking about intersectional perspectives, we're talking about actually just kind of bringing diversity to the table at quite base level. And it was kind of, a lot of the time, it was kind of just hard to have that conversation without it blending into something else. And you kind of mentioned challenges that you know, Black people face, and then it becomes a very kind of broad conversation around diversity. And the gender conversation had progressed a lot further, I'd say, than the race conversation, and they were buckets. They weren't intersecting. And then we had COVID, and that really shifted the conversation in terms of how we support people who were vulnerable, and people who were vulnerable came from very specific communities, and suddenly there was a different kind of consciousness which affected our work. We started working a lot more with local councils who were trying to support residents who had been particularly affected by furlough, who were in the kinds of jobs that were most affected by COVID and likely to be unemployed, people who were most likely to run offline, non-digital businesses and who needed support in terms of digitalizing what they did. And so our work shifted. And then there was another shift around the time of George Floyd in 2020 and the horrible incident that happened that really sparked that global conversation. We found suddenly we were kind of going from a conversation at a very broad level to the really specific interventions that were needed for founders who were growing businesses in the Black community. And so it's been a really interesting journey to see how the organisation has changed and what that's meant for the kinds of organisations we partner with and with government as well. So with the government piece, so we have been part of conversations in different ways, and one thing that we've always wanted to highlight is the importance of kind of seeing talking about the really specific challenges that exist and not putting the conversation into broad buckets. So if we're talking about Black women, let's talk about Black women. If we're talking about working class women who live in Tower Hamlets, let's talk about that. If we're talking about the challenges that refugee entrepreneurs face in Lambeth, let's talk about that. And just being really specific about that, recognizing that the challenges that one group or one set of intersecting groups have is different from another. So to give an example of that, We work with Campari Group, who own sort of Ray and Nephew. Ray and Nephew, I don't know if if anyone's a rum fan, but they have a very specific, strong presence in Afro-Caribbean communities. They have a strong presence amongst kind of lower income, working class individuals, businesses that are, you know, your sort of hair shop or your barber or your kind of like local food store. It was just a very specific set of programs that they wanted to run to address those challenges. And I think that the nuance is also is always very important to us. And so this isn't just for everyone. This is recognizing the specific challenges that this group or these set of groups face, and how we can design interventions that are specific for them. That means having individuals with lived experience deliver the sessions that we deliver. That means going into these communities, whether that's going into the churches, going into the local community centres, and seeing where we can deliver at the kind of places that these people tend to go to, rather than delivering accelerators in central London, which is often a challenge for people. It means considering how we're delivering. And COVID was a really big lesson for all of us in terms of how we deliver our work online. And for us, it's like, what does it mean to deliver programs which are online, where you have people who may have childcare responsibilities, you have people who are neurodiverse and need to access content differently. There was a lot of work in that time to make sure that our work was accessible and it was inclusive as well. I think that one of the biggest challenges that I faced in terms of having this conversation is that in the 5 years that we've been running at Foundervine, and Rana brought it up so brilliantly in terms of the Extend Ventures research that showed in the 10-year period from 2009 to 2019, you know, you saw only, I think it was about 38 Black businesses receive venture capital funding. You saw only 0.24% of them were Black women-led businesses, etc. There's a lot of conversation about what needs to happen in the investment space. There's a lot of conversation about what needs to happen in terms of access into entrepreneurship. But despite these conversations we're having, the needle isn't moving quickly enough. And it's because even though we recognize that the changes need to happen, and I tell you, you will not meet an investor who doesn't say, I would love more applications from women, I'd love more applications from disabled entrepreneurs, you know, but in terms of the actual work that needs to happen, structural changes that need to happen to kind of bring equality into every stage of the process, like in that diagram, we're simply just not seeing that level of conversation yet. I think there's still a very long way to go. And so we often talk about it in the press, we often talk about it on the round tables we host, just making sure that we're actually holding these kinds of stakeholders accountable in what they're going to do moving forward. Forgive me for the amount of text on these slides as well. It's an absolute faux pas to have a presentation with so much text, but I did want to kind of show sort of case studies of the kinds of programs we run. So with Lloyds Bank, when they initially reached out to us, we knew that we wanted, one, to work with them in a sustainable way. So it had to be a long-term program that had a series of interventions for different stages of the entrepreneurial journey, and also was very nuanced to the specific challenges that Black entrepreneurs face. It's been a real journey working with Lloyds, 300-year-old bank, who you could say are kind of maybe stuck in their ways a bit and kind of move kind of like a massive ship. And so everything takes longer. But they were committed. They were committed to understanding the issues. They were committed to making sure that interventions really met people where they were. They commissioned research that we engaged with as well, that found that there was still a lot of distrust in the Black community with regard to accessing banks and to interacting. There was still a lot of feelings, you know, whether real or perceived, about the success rate when it came to getting a loan for them versus someone, and lots of interesting case studies anecdotally at the time of someone applying for a loan with their original Nigerian name, for example, and then applying as Robert and being selected the second time, and that kind of stuff. And so was really important to us that we designed interventions that engendered trust, that showed that long-term commitment and build that confidence in entrepreneurs. And I think it's so important that we recognize that the reason we need more nuanced interventions is because in mainstream programs and initiatives, the focus is on building technical skills, the focus is on building networks, all that stuff you need to have. But if you are working with women, if you're working with diverse communities, if you're working with people who've traditionally been shut out of the space, you need to be investing just as much time in terms of confidence building, in terms of re-establishing trust, in terms of building a sense of shared endeavor. You know, I get you, I'm an ally, we can move forward together, as well as delivering on the kind of technical and operational support that's needed to help them grow. That was the Immerse programming on the Boys Bank. Similarly, when Sainsbury's approached us, they were really interested in solving the big problem they had, which was that less than 2% of brands on supermarket shelves are owned by Black-led organizations, right? So brands who are innovating in the food and drink space can face massive challenges when it comes to accessing buyers and getting into traditional retail. And they said, we want to focus on Black founders specifically. And it was really important that they were very specific in terms of the intervention that they were trying to sort out. And I think it's really interesting because often I get asked that question of kind of why are you focused on this community rather than that community? Why are you focused on this rather than that? And you know, I know I'm preaching to the converted a little bit on this call, but it's so important we recognise that you know, we need to create spaces that solve specific issues, and the more specific we can be about the issue, the better. And so on our programs, we make sure that we are setting ourselves targets, which I'll get to shortly, on how well we're doing in engaging various kind of groups and actually dealing with those intersections. So, for example, on our most recent programs that we've had live, which are kind of funded under the UK Shared Prosperity Funds, kind of levelling up post-Brexit funding, we're running 2 programs that we've built that are designed to support founders from diverse backgrounds, yes, but we set ourselves really specific targets in terms of who. For the digital tech ecosystem, it can be really challenging finding women who are building and innovating in these spaces. It just is. And sometimes it's easier to just not set specific targets and just say, oh, great, we got 7 women onto the program of the 35 that we're targeting, great. When it comes to minority founders, similar challenges, but I think we're in a very good place in that our community kind of reflects a lot of diversity in terms of ethnic diversity, and sometimes our challenge is actually reaching out kind of more broadly. And then disability has been a really interesting one for us as well. So we really want to build relationships with ecosystem partners who support disabled entrepreneurs, but there are really big challenges that are faced. So if you are a disabled entrepreneur, and 25% of businesses are operated by disabled or neurodiverse individuals, it can be really challenging accessing the tools and support you need to build your business, but also the systems that are in place to access investment. I really love what Access to Funding are doing at the moment. It's co-founded by a fantastic founder called Celia Chatrasaris, and I know her because she's also angel investing into disabled founders at the moment. She's in all of these photos. It's just kind of an AI generated image, but you know, she recently posted about AI recognizing diversity and disability, and she does a lot of work campaigning for you know, more support for disabled founders. I ask myself, what can I do to build more spaces for organizations like hers? It might not be directly what we're doing at the moment, but the more we can kind of collaborate as organizations in this space and kind of jointly run programs and initiatives, the better. And so that's kind of a big focus for me at the moment in the social investment space. So alongside my role leading Foundervine, I also sit on a number of boards. So on the board of Capital Enterprise, which do fantastic work to support kind of sort of deep tech and AI and machine learning entrepreneurs kind of to grow and scale. I advise Lloyd's Banking Group in terms of their Black Business Programme. And one of the things that I love most is sitting on the Investment Advisory Committee for the Growth Impact Fund. And many of you will be familiar with what the fund is doing at the moment. £25 million fund committed to investing in social impact organisations who are doing really, really great stuff in the sort of inclusion sustainability space. That kind of process in terms of embedding equality at every stage is something that they are actively doing, and their portfolio map weights, commitment to diversity, founders with lived experience, policies around kind of inclusion, all of those things weights it in a way that I've just not really seen in the mainstream venture capital kind of fund space. So they have that built in, and they're very, very diligent as an investment team of making sure the portfolio is always mapping to what those targets are from an inclusion perspective and a return on investment perspective. The fact they have an all-women investment advisory committee, I think, is amazing, and that wasn't by design. It was actually completely by accident, and and it just kind of shows that you can do it. There's no excuse; you can actually have that in place. So I'll leave it there for now. But I think the last thing that I wanted to say is just like the importance of visibility in this space. I cringe so much when it comes to kind of public speaking or press and that kind of stuff, but I recognise that it's so important that I'm not just doing it for myself, and I kind of have to be quite loud in what I'm doing, because there are not as many Black women as there can be doing the kind of work that I do in this space. And every single person that I meet who says, hey, actually, it was after attending that Foundervine event or seeing you post that thing on LinkedIn that made me start pursuing this idea that I had, but I felt like I didn't have the skill set or the network to do it. And every time I hear that, and I hear it so often nowadays, it makes me realize that as women who are intersecting, whatever those intersections are, we need to actually be as loud as we can, and we need to hold power accountable for that. Just yesterday, I was at the Labour Party conference at Fringe event on a round table on social sort of building inclusion in the social investment sector, and I was so proud to see just like the diversity of that room. There are so many of us who are doing it. We just need to be louder. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you.